Hello everyone, and welcome to Gabriel's Cave, where I do my painting in a very sad, dark, cold place. Today I'll be painting the Stark Sworn Swords, or short S Sworn Swords. Anyway, to begin with, we're gonna just do a simple base coat of all the metallics. That means just getting a nice even layer over the chainmail, the completely metal shields, the rims, the shoulder pads, the helmets, the swords, of course, and just making sure it's a nice and smooth layer. All you have to do is just make sure your paint is nice and thin, and just go over it. And it shouldn't take more than 1 or 2 layers if you just do a decent consistency. Not too thin, not too thick, and it'll be perfect. Now, when applying the wash over all of these, all you have to do really is just make sure your metal base is solid first, just because if you have any gaps, then it'll definitely be a bother to try and clean it up, since you'll add on the metal and then it won't match the wash you did. So just keep that in mind. But what I'm doing is just putting a nice even layer over most areas, except for the helmet, the sword, and the shield. And for those, I'm concentrating the wash in certain areas, and I do that by repeatedly building a gradient, or just adding a nice even coat, and then using my thumb, or you could use like just a slightly wetted paintbrush with no paint or wash on it, and just soak up some of that extra where you don't want it in those areas. And that'll be a very easy way to create a nice variation of color, instead of just having an even layer of wash, which doesn't look exactly realistic, especially on larger areas. As you can see here, it's already starting to look pretty good, but if the gradient isn't perfect, you can always go back and just add another layer and just gently, put in another wash, and just cover up those mistakes that you've made. Like, especially if you soak something up, it might leave a harsh line, so just keep that in mind. And of course, for the flag, you just want to just put a nice even layer on the spike and then just wash it down, and it's as simple as that. But don't forget, you might want to also paint the base as well. That little bottom there, I just put a nice simple metal coat. Now, for the great coats on the soldiers, I decided to go with a mixed color. So I have Rakarth Flesh, which is kind of a gray beige, and then a bluish gray, and when I mix them together, it creates this nice kind of stark pale color. And so now when you're adding that variety of light to it, from the highlights to the shadows, I use those base colors and took advantage of how they were mixed together to form that base tone, so I could create this nice kind of matching shadow and highlight effect. So it would relate to the base color because they were both part of it, but it would still kind of have its own identity because of the fact you have this more bleached look versus a more saturated bluish gray color. And so what I did was I took the bluish gray and kind of did a second lighter, I wouldn't say lighter coat, but kind of painted over that base color, and then I painted the kind of mid-tone and highlight color in the appropriate areas, and so that would allow the base tone to show through as well as the highlight colors. And so when you're blending them together, they're not going to be completely obscuring that base tone, and it acts more as kind of lenses. You're seeing the different sections of coat through. So you can see I'm applying that darker shade on the back. And so what I'll do is I'll hit the lighter shade on the top near where the chainmail ends around the neck, and then I'll blend that into the darker tones, but of course leave not put any highlight or brighter color underneath, pardon me, the armpits where the darkest color would reside. And so that allows you to get that nice realistic look without having to do too much work. It's just a nice straightforward blend, really. And all you have to do is just make sure when you're painting, the lighter color and the darker color are both wet. And if you ever see blatant mistakes that are there's two sharp lines, just let it completely dry and then use a nice thin coat of whatever might be the mid-tone or maybe the lighter tone, depending on how much you need to fix and what area where it is. Like, let's say there's only a small amount of highlight and you want more, then maybe use the lighter tone to blend it in. But of course, it's all up to you. And you just understand that you need just a nice, simple kind of set of tones to just make the model work. You don't really need to perfect it as you would one of the characters. Now for the shields with the wood, I did a variety of browns, mixing just like two types of brown colors I have, some yellow, some black, a black and a white, just to get a nice variety of tones. Then I just hit it with a brown wash, and then maybe you could do just a little bit of highlighting using maybe white mixed in with that base tone you use for the wood, and it's that straightforward. And of course the wolf sigils, just using like a nice darkish gray color, like a good stark gray, or you could just mix a white and a black together, and it'll and just find the right tone. Then for kind of the undergarments, you have these little pieces, areas of cloth that kind of peek out from underneath the greatcoat. So I decided to do different colors, so nice greens and beiges and browns, and just adding a little variety to them I thought would be nice. And then of course I'm just washing it over with like a strong tone, which is like a blackish brown, and that worked pretty well for all the colors I used. Now for the leather, I decided just to use a uniform color, but of course you could use a variety of tones if you'd like. It would be a subtle difference, I would feel, unless you wanted to go quite extreme. But I felt like that's not the feeling you want to get. They're not a bunch of brigands. They're still kind of a uniform set of men, even if they are hailing from quite a few different places. I felt it would be better if they had this feeling of uniformity, even though they are not as uniform as the Lannisters. I painted the kind of the fold over from the boot different colors, but then I realized it would look better if it was just kind of a nice leather brown color like the boots. And so I interpreted it as just how the boot, it doesn't come to a point, it folds over, you know, and I just kind of took it as that. So after you get all the leathers down, the shield straps, the belts, the straps on the shoulder plate, and the gloves if you want to add that, then you can go in and add a brown wash. And this isn't about getting really the texture, but rather getting the tones kind of shifted a little bit. And it gives it, I feel, a more rugged look than the plain unwashed leather. Then you can go back with the original base coat and just add a little highlighting just to add a little brightness in the preferred areas. Now we're going to be starting on the face, and I'm doing basically the same thing as we saw with the Lannister guardsman before, which is adding Bugman's Glow, then adding the Barbarian Flesh kind of mid-tone You could also use Cadian Flesh or whatever brand you like to use. It's just basically having that darker reddish tone and then having that nice mid-tone. Same thing with the hand. Add that Bugman's Glow darker tone, then the mid-tone, then add a wash, and then after that just have increasing levels of brightness until you decide that something is bright enough. And that's really the process here. And it doesn't take too much time simply because when you're doing this with 12 or 24, how many of them you bought, all you have to worry about is just hitting that small area and then going on to the next one, hitting that small area, going on to the next one, and just being a little careful later on about where you're putting your colors. So as you can see, I've added the wash now, and then I'll be focusing on those highlight areas. So I'm taking that mid-tone again, and I'm going to be putting it just on the kind of upper cheek area and the nose and the chin, if that's visible. And that will be kind of the starting point of my increasing highlights of color. And so after the mid-tone, I'm going to be just mixing in a brighter tone, but I would recommend actually making a gradient. And so what you would do is mix in the Bugman's Glow or whatever dark tone you like to use, the medium tone, and then the light tone. And so what this will create is a variety of colors that incorporates each of the tones in the set. So this means your lighter tones will still have that deeper and mid flesh color, which will look a lot more natural than just having this kind of palish white color, because there will be that slight hint of that in natural human flesh tones. Just if you look at your own skin, you can see it's a very complex set of browns and maybe reds. Depending on your skin color, it does change quite dramatically. But for the paler flesh of the northerners, you're going to get a very light Caucasian skin tone, and that implies having some browns in there, but also some hints of pink. And you can get all of those things when you have that kind of reddish tone, that kind of mid tone, which is a bit too dark. But then when you incorporate all these highlights, it reaches that pale appropriate range of brightness, which is the natural skin tone. So now I'm painting the flagstaff, and one thing to note is that I added some wood grain just using a very sharp hobby knife and just running it down to get a little bit of texture. I found that if you don't paint it, it looks quite odd, because instead of having this nice kind of wood texture, it just looks very off. What you could also do is make this wood texture by adding like different lines of color. So you'd have the appearance of wood grain without actually having to do with texture and washing it. And so that's a different way of doing it, and that could add a nice bit of realism. So now I'm just adding some more touches, like I use the Bugman's Glow tone for the lips, and I found it actually works pretty well. You could brighten it up a little bit with that mid-tone, and depending on what kind of color you want, but I felt that worked out pretty well. And of course, this is the stage where we're just cleaning up the model, so if you see any colors where they shouldn't be, then just get them out of the way. Now that we're working on the facial hair, there's a few things to keep in mind. You really don't need to put any washes down simply because the area is so small. If you just follow these basic guidelines, it'll be quite a simple and rewarding task. So first off, I recommend you mix a variety of tones. So you could go pure black, gray, make a different nice set of grays, make a nice set of browns using a little bit of red, yellow, just make it quite a few tones, and just kind of, you can just play as you go. And what this will create is a very nice variety of mustache and beard colors. And after you finish that, take those original colors you used for painting that hair, and then mix in white or yellow or maybe a combination, and then add, just gently dash as I'm doing here, and what you can see the result. It creates a very nice set of highlights that will really help the hair stand out. Now for the final step, or at least my final step, I decided to paint the flag in the same colors as their great cloaks. I thought that would match pretty well. And for the colors and the blending, I decided to do the same thing. And I left this as the last step because I got used to working with those tones, and I realized it would be best if I really learned how to work with them well and really got the feeling of them before I started blending on the flag, which is, I think, by far one of the most important things, simply because it's quite noticeable. And if you do a really poor or simple paint job, then it'll be quite noticeable. Not as much on your infantry, especially like, you know, their boots or something like that. They're not going to be as eye-catching as just something as big as the flag. So make sure you have a nice blend on it. Just kind of add darker colors, you know, in those deeper areas, and lighter colors in those kind of areas that stick out. Just do the same thing on the back side. And of course, carefully just paint the edges and the wolf, and that's basically it. If you want to check out more tutorials like how I did this basing, you can go to my A Song of Ice and Fire playlist. If you want to see some fun stuff, check out my Shapeways, link in the description. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys for the next one.